Fine, I got it.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first 2020 Hand Tools Special Interest Group. What we're gonna do is we started this kind of on the fly back in March or April, and we have had a lot of people join the association since then, and hopefully our viewership has changed a little bit. So I'm going to sort of cycle it around each year. We're going to start back with just a look at hand tools and how they've been used traditionally, and how machines have kind of taken over a lot of that work. So before I do that, I'd like to introduce our producer, Lewis, who's been doing it for quite some time, and also to...
Hey, everybody.
You notice that he's wearing a San Diego Fine Woodworkers mask.
And it doesn't cover a beard, but it gets as close as you can get to it.
So anyway, that's one of the new things at San Diego Fine Woodworkers is the masks. I hope they'll find their way onto the logo material that's for sale at the general meetings at some point. But anyway, I'm going to start in about hand tools, and we're going to talk about hand tools and machines and the juxtaposition between them and the choices that people make about what they use. So I'm going to go into the history a little bit. So those of you who watched before know that the earliest known plane was discovered in a Roman settlement, I think at Pompeii, and there's also been one discovered in St. Albans in England, which was a Roman settlement a couple of thousand years ago. So in the couple of millennia since, nothing much changed until the late 1700s, 1800s. By and large, if you needed a plane and you needed something to flatten surfaces well, you got something like this. This was what you would use for finishing, a coffin plane, it's known, little wooden block planes. All you needed really was a blacksmith with the right iron and who had knowledge of blades, and they would make blades for you. Or if you were really lucky, you could afford to buy a blade made maybe by a specialist. Marking tools were also made out of wood and possibly incorporating a little brass. This is by older standards, pretty fancy one, but it's made today, so you can still buy that. Wooden tools in terms of mallets, wooden handled chisels. The blades of the chisels would be, we have better steel these days. In all honesty, we have such good steel these days that, you know, there's this talk of old steel is good, but some of the new steel is really good. We also traditionally used a few, traditionally squares and things for marking out would be wood. I'm actually going to make a set soon. You have, you know, Mitre squares, dividers, which are used a lot by people in drawing as well, but for woodwork they're great because you can transfer exact measurements without having to take a measurement, transfer it to your brain, and then transfer it back onto something else. You don't even have a pencil line intervening. So dividers are great. Most woodworkers who work with wood do that. And of course, before we had these nice manufactured pencils, most marking was done with a knife, which if you want to do precise hand tool woodwork is still the best way to go. If you're cutting dovetails or anything like that. If we, so let's sort of transition to what happened in the 1700s and the 1800s was the Industrial Revolution began to get going, and smelting of iron and mining of iron and so on became industrial, and factories began to exist, and specialists, what traditionally the things that were done to make things like, you know, carriages and carts and mill wheels and all sorts of things were made out of wood. So there was a substantial craft of wood in society, of woodworkers in society. And with the Industrial Revolution, that began to die away because now you began to get metal wheels made and metal chassis made, and you began to get the introduction of the locomotive and eventually the automobile. And the world really began to change at a very fast pace. And along with that came a certain amount of mechanization in the woodworking trades, out of sheer necessity, because it began to be impractical to do, say, a large order using the labor that was disappearing rapidly into the factories. And you just, you couldn't find craftsmen, and the crafts began to fade away at that point. And in the increasing industrialization, there also came a revolution in woodworking machines, not just in terms of electric machines happening, around the late 1800s and later, but in terms of the manufacturing of tools and the design of hand tools. So many of the tools that I'm going to show you today were only designed in the last 150 years, but they are still variations on the ancient tools that have been used for time immemorial. While we're in this part of the shop, what I'm going to do today is go around, we're going to look at the machines in the shop, and we're going to compare the tools that we use traditionally for it, the hand tools. Not all of my tools date back to the 1700s and 1800s, but some of them are at least 100 years old. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is lathes. Because we're in this part of it, there's no logical progression to this. We're just going to go through except that is the way around the shop. We have over here some lathes, and we also have a couple of CNC machines. And of course, the CNC machine is very obviously a high-tech piece of machinery, but it still does a function that was done by these carving tools. So this is the traditional way to carve, and this is the high-tech and 20th century way to carve. As you can see, the tools have various different shapes, and you're able to get all sorts of things, but you do need a little bit of skill. With regard to lathes, we do have tools that we can make things around with today. I have a nice little spoke shave here that is specifically designed for, I think it's something less than a 2-inch radius. But you can also, on larger radii, you can use spoke shaves to create spoke shaves and planes. And I've done a couple of demonstrations of that sort of thing in the past. But also the lathe itself, the modern lathe again, it's using metal, but it has an electric motor on it. The traditional lathe used a certain amount of metal for the framework, but was run by, well, the pole lathe, for example, was run by a long pole that was very springy and a rope that ran around through a pulley and was secured to a pedal that you pumped with your foot, and that would make your lathe go. It would obviously, you've got to back it up every foot pump, but at least you could turn something circular and you could get a really nice circular object with relative ease. So you'll notice in furniture that's even 300-400 years ago, there are some nicely turned pieces on those. So the lathe really is a development. The modern lathe is a development of the traditional lathe, but before there were lathes, people were able to make things reasonably round by drawing things out and tools. So now what I'm going to do is we'll go around the shop tools and take a look at them, and I will show you some of the tools that we've used. So we're going to move first of all over to the saw bench.
Paul?
Sorry, the table saw. The one object that most woodworkers probably consider to be vital in their wood shop, and many people have them. We teach
Paul, I think we had a question. Was someone asking a question?
Yeah, I was just curious about the notion of powering tools. The first table had all hand tools, but then we transitioned to the lathe where you could actually use a foot pedal. And I know early sewing machines were the same sort of thing. And there must have been a time before things were driven by steam, et cetera, where they were powered by, say, flowing water in a river. Yes. Or hand pumping something. Or was that a small part of tools before there was real power? There was this self-power or nature power?
Yes, I remember I went to the Shaker Village in John Hancock's Shaker Village in Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts, near Pittsfield. And they ran all of their machines. The Shakers, although they were kind of old-fashioned, they did go with the times, and they designed and built machinery. They ran an entire wood shop on water, and they would have the water would turn through some kind of wheel, would turn into a rotational mechanism, and then they would use leather belts to transmit the power out throughout the shop. So yes, electricity wasn't the only motive power, but there were also limitations to the speed that it would work at. And you know, I've seen a planing machine at that Shaker Village that was just something else. It was basically a router on a sled, but it was powered by water, and obviously we moved the file at speed.
Thank you.
Okay, so table saws. We use our table saws for a lot of different things: angle cutting, cross cutting, rip cutting, and so on. And the traditional tool that I thought that jumped to mind most of all was the Ripsaw. This is a relatively old one. There are obviously different sizes, different grades. There are two-people saws and so on. But these basic saws, you can achieve a lot of what you can achieve on a table saw with these. One of the things about using these different machines is these machines didn't necessarily replace, in some cases they replaced one single function that a woodworker did a great deal. But they also replaced the work of many tools. To achieve what we can achieve with the table saw, we need a saw and a plane at the very least, plus, you know, our divide, our marking tools and all of that fun stuff that we use also with these, but we've got things like fences to guide us with straight lines. But this is a Ripsaw in the time-honored tradition, and you would use a stool. In this case, I've used a couple of stools here, and you could cut a nice straight line. I'm not going to cut far, but it's relatively easy if your saw is sharp. But draw my guideline. Now, that's not a very good line because I didn't have a line marked. So when you're working with hand tools, you use lines. You mark everything that you do almost until you get really good, and I'm not anywhere close to that. But you mark everything. But you can train yourself to cut a really nice straight line with this.
Is your force on that on the push or the pull?
It's kind of a light force here. I'm sorry, yes, it's on the push. It's on the push. So this is a Western saw. In Asia, they came up with different saws that tend to pull rather than push. And that's the challenge for me, is when I'm pushing, I tend to twist my hand like that. So the key is almost a feather-like, feather-like grip on it, but you let the sharp blades do the work. But yes, you're on the push. So there's almost, you need nothing in terms of force on the back. But here's push. You can hear the cutting, and then it's quiet. And of course, the deeper the saw, the longer, the more guide you have for your straight line. But anyway, so this is a crosscut saw. If we're going to do it with the crosscut with the saw bench here, the table saw, we use a sled, but this is a crosscut saw. So if this were a regular piece of wood, I was actually cutting against the visible grain. If this were not plywood, obviously this, generally speaking, my shorter edge would be a crosscut cut, and this would be a rip cut. Both can be achieved with two different saws. You can even use one saw for the function of the other. Then as you get into finer stuff, so we can make tenons on this. We can't make mortises, but we can use the table saw to make tenons. This is a small tenon saw specifically designed for cutting tenons. It's close to new, and so this is a cross-cut saw. Again, but in the future, I'll go into the difference between a rip and a cross-cut saw, the actual physical differences. But you'll notice that this saw has a nice firm back in order to give me a nice straight blade. So this is a cross-cut saw. This is another cross-cut saw, and more in the, little older. It's a French brand. And here we have a Ripsaw. So this would be used for perhaps cutting a dado. If you're not a dado, a groove. So you would use a saw to cut either side of that groove and then chisel out. If you didn't have any kind of dado equipment, or you couldn't afford a router plane, which I'll talk about later. So cross-cut saws. Then there are the Japanese saws. This is my favorite dovetail saw. It says razor saw on it. If you're beginning woodworking, I would recommend that you start with Japanese saws, because you pull them towards you, and it seems to be a little easier. It was certainly easier for me to pull towards me in a straight line than it is to push away from me in a straight line. So I can set this baby up and actually eyeball the pull if I need to. This is so a dovetail saw is specifically a Ripsaw. This is a smaller one. That's a really nice little saw. This is a crosscut saw for general use. Again, very, very, very sharp, and worth treating with respect, because I've got it. It's almost healed, but I got two nice stripes there from being in the way of the saw. Okay, so one other thing while I'm here is that we have over here a saw that's also used for crosscuts. And if it's set up just right, it'll give you a beautiful, perfect 90-degree cut, or 45, or whatever you need. But if you're using hand tools and a saw such as I've just been showing you, everything's subject to the human touch. So if you haven't been able to yet train yourself to do perfect cuts like that, then there are various objects you can make to help you. So for example, say I've just now cut on a piece of wood where I have no more room to cut anymore. I've cut a crosscut saw on that, and it's just a little, half a degree off, but I'm making a box. Half a degree is going to cause a gap. So there's a little tool that you can make called a shooting board, and it is good for both. You can make a long grain, or with the grain, you can make a long version of this to give you a perfect 90-degree edge, right? Which we'll talk about at the jointer shortly, or a perfect 90-degree cross. So you set up a plane on its side here. You can see we're just shaving off those little shavings, and because the plane is guided by the shooting board, and I have a little groove here to get rid of waste. It's actually, there's more to it than just a few blocks of wood. There's a little bit of design in there. It means that instead of having to square an edge by putting it in a vise and planing it and then checking it, I can get it perfectly, just like that. So if I use a bandsaw to cut wood, I'll just take it to a shooting board. And this is a really nice plane. It's a low angle shooting, not shooting, it's actually a low angle jack plane. We'll talk about the different planes in a minute. And a homemade holder, so that when it's on its side, I can still do it without smashing my knuckles. Or if I'm doing a lot of this, I get blisters there. So,
Are those saws labeled? We got a question. Are those
Yes.
saws labeled ripping?
Sorry?
Are those saws labeled ripping? Are those ripping a board
Are the saws?
or cross-cut, or do you need to know how to read the teeth?
Oh, well, if you've got a mix of, I The reason you notice that I put crosscut and
Yeah.
rip on here, that's because I've got enough of these floating around that I forget what is what. So I put that on there. But
Does it
yes,
matter though?
You have to examine the
Okay.
teeth. The crosscut gives a slightly wider, usually a slightly wider curve, and the rip cut is designed more to, without going into detail, but yes, you need to look at the teeth, which with these fine teeth like this, you know, when you've got sort of 16 teeth per inch, it can be a little difficult to see, but so I like to mark them, especially when they've got fine teeth. In my Japanese saws, I don't have a lot of them, so basically the ones that have a back on them are the ones that are sold for dovetailing. And although this is really nice for small stuff, for general use stuff, I like this because it's got a nice long handle. I can pull it straight towards me, have a lot of control. But for small stuff, this is a really, really good saw. So, any other questions before we?
Yep, we got one more. What are you using to protect the teeth? Are those plastic sheaths? Do they come with the saw?
They just came with the saw, and I don't have them for all. I'm actually in the process of making a tool chest now that will have saw tilts, so I will keep them in wooden slots. But I tend to keep the plastic on the ones that I'd be most upset if they got damaged.
Right.
You have to, yeah, you can. I have tried making sleeves out of thin pieces of wood, 2 pieces of wood with a slight spacer in between on one side, but I haven't been very successful yet. But yes, I tend to protect the teeth, especially when I'm moving them around. If they're just hanging in the shop, that's another thing. But ultimately, most hand tool workers actually want to make boxes to keep their, or make chests to keep their tools in. I'm just taking my first shot at it. While we're here, I'm going to just show you the traditional, one of the things that, no, I'm sorry, I got off track. Let's move on to the jointer and the planes. So as you know, yes, this is because you got one. Those in the back. As you know, if you want to get a piece of wood 4 square and you want to do it in the shop, you start off by using one of these large jointers, get it nice and flat. You get one surface flat. Once you've got one surface flat, you've got something to work with. So you then might get an edge flat. And for that, both of those functions, you'd use a jointer. Either one of these will do both functions. And then once you've got that, now you've got an edge and you've got the face on one face flat. So now you move over to the thickness planer here, which now you've got that one flat plane. You can use the bottom plane of the thickness planer, the bed, which is dead flat, to run your piece through and get another flat face that is parallel to it. So how do we do that when you buy your stuff from the sawmill and you put it on a cart and you take it home to your shop and you've got all these, it might have been sliced into pieces, but they probably need drying and they probably need a lot of work, because rough sawn is exactly that. It's rough sawn and wood moves and it twists. So when we're doing things by hand, each board has to be prepared by hand. So you start off, in order to get a flat plane, one of the very first things that you do is, these are just sticks that I found in the shop. I forgot to bring my winding sticks. But you take the board that you want to work, and you take 2 preferably contrasting dead straight pieces of wood, and you look at them. You stand back a bit and you look at them and you see if they're out of level with each other. And if they are, that means you have a twist and you can start to work towards that. So what one does is one sets up, imagine this were a much bigger board, you set this up, clamp it in place so that nothing is sticking up beyond your plane, and then you use something like one of these guys, which has a very long, very flat surface. if it's tuned up right. And you start off going across grain, and you just work away at it. These things have enough mass that they actually make the work fairly easy, because once you get them going, they push themselves through. You start off by working down the whole board across the grain, then you go on the other side and you work it diagonally, and you're using, as you work, you're using the straight edge. Again, it can be made out of a nice piece of stable wood. This was the nicest straight edge I could find in the shop here, which is just a ruler, which I use a lot. I have a ruler that's both a straight edge and a ruler. The 3-foot rule, it has a bit of shape to it so that it maintains straight edge in all respects. But this is just fine as a straight edge. So you put it across a piece of wood and you keep working at it. And once you've got something that is reasonably straight along here, reasonably flat along here, you then start working along the grain, and you would use, again, still using your jointer, you would flatten that off. And by the way, these planes are, I was talking about how the technology came in with iron and steel. So back in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, a gentleman called Bailey designed what is essentially the modern plane, which is the development of the traditional wooden plane that I spoke about back there. The most common angle is 45 degrees for a regular plane, and it's exactly the same angle as that one over there, but he designed it, had a couple of features. It had an adjustable frog. That is you can move it back and forth, so you can adjust how close the blade is to the mouth. So you'll see this one is close enough for general use. If I wanted to get a finer cut, I'd be pulling the blade back and getting a finer cut and then moving it forward. But they give a significant advantage over a wooden plane. Plus they have some adjustments. A wooden plane you adjust with a mallet or a hammer, but this has some adjustments, so it's some control over your blade angle and so on. So his patent was bought out. He made a few planes, but didn't really industrialize on it. Was bought out by Stanley in I think the late 1800s, and almost all Stanleys ever since have the word Bailey or Stanley planes. So all it means is it's along Bailey's design.
We have two questions.
Yes.
One is, what materials do you use to protect metal hand tools from moisture or oxidation?
I usually use camellia oil.
And you rub that all over the tool?
Yes. Well, I rub it specifically on the blades. I use wax on the plane faces, partly to protect it from rust, but also to in order to reduce the friction. So a can of wax on your bench is really worth having, because when you're working a big plane like this, less friction you have. You want all that energy to go into cutting the fibers of the wood and into pushing it across the plane. So camellia oil, wax, jojoba oil. The best thing is to keep it in a dust, and even dust has corrosives on it. In a dust and damp-free environment, a tool chest, preferably one that's reasonably well sealed. I'm making one that has 100 dovetails in it at the moment.
All right, and in terms of progression of planing, do you start with diagonal and cross grain and then finish with towards the grain?
Absolutely, yes. Once you've got that general flatness, you've eliminated any, your high points and low points, and you've got the twists and so on, and you've got something that's reasonably flat, then you can start working it along
with the grain.
edge. And as you create a finer and finer edge, you start moving into the smoothing planes. So this is a jointer. This is a tri-square that I own and use as my jointer, just because I haven't got around to getting one yet. But our next progression is to get that flat surface flat. I mean, get it a finer surface. This will give you, if it's set up right, will give you a really nice, something close to finish. But if a smoothing plane is set up really nicely, and this one is a Scottish infill plane from the 1920s, set up. If you set this thing up just right, it will take super, super, super thin shavings off of your surface and will leave you with a surface that, unless it's full of grain, doesn't need any further treatment. Here's another smoother. This is one that's made today. I bought it about 3-4 weeks ago. I did buy it used, but it's effectively brand new. It's really nice. It's made by Veritas, and it's really nice. Another object that we use a lot in getting surfaces, and this guides into, you can see over here we have a couple of sanding machines, and we have various sanding machines over here, and they all perform the function of basically flattening the wood. So even when I take something off of the table saw, sometimes it's burned because either it's a wood with a lot of sugar in it, or the blade's getting a little dull, or there's a few factors that can, anybody who's used a table saw that doesn't burn has got it really tuned up nicely. But sometimes you have burns, so you can use something like a block plane on the edge to take that burn off. A couple of 1/1000th inch thick shavings will very often remove that burn, whereas sanding it can be a bit of a pain. And you tend to change the shape of that face. So you don't have to spend a lot of money on it. This is an old Stanley that I bought for $15. I tuned it up.
Where's the most reliable place to get good hand tools like these?
You have to get different tools from different places, and it depends what you want. There are a couple of plane manufacturers who I would not hesitate to recommend you spend the money on their planes. Their planes are not cheap, but Veritas from Canada, they're sold through Lee Valley, is one really good company. I also buy some tools from Highland Tools. They sell Lee Nielsen tools. The Lee Nielsen tools, again, are really, really high quality tools. The low angle bevel up plane that I showed you there on the shooting board is a Lee Nielsen, and this is a Lee Nielsen. And all you've got to do is just look at the way it looks, and you can see this is a lovingly created tool, and a very, very high quality tool. Lee Nielsen and Veritas tools tend to be usable straight out of the box, but Veritas make a lot of interesting looking tools that they've created and innovated themselves, some of which I've bought and I've found to be not much good. So I tend to stick to the basics with people like Veritas and Lee Nielsen to what they do with this. And this is one I bought new several years ago, again, a Lee Nielsen. If you're a beginning woodworker and you want to spend a little money on a tool that will last you the rest of your life, this is the one. The little 60.5 Lee Nielsen block plane is an astonishingly flexible tool. Really, really nice tool. You can use it for smoothing. Sometimes if I can't get a smoothing plane to work really well for me, and you do get that with different woods. We're working with different woods, different grains, different textures and so on. So, but you can use this for an astonishing amount of use. Does that answer?
Yep.
Any other questions? Okay, another way to get away from the sanding thing, and a traditional way that if you think about a craftsperson working, maybe in a largely agricultural environment, you had to in order to sand things, you had to buy things like shark skin and so on back in the day. They didn't have nicely made, 3M sandpaper. So what you did is you took an old saw that had finally worn out or got bent or whatever, and you took part of it, and you cut out part of it, and you basically on the corners here, you create a very, very sharp little edge. It's not very big and it wears out quick, but you scrape. It's called a card scraper, and you scrape. You can get them in different shapes, so you can scrape ins and outs. There's another. You've got a different one shape there and one shape there, both the same. This will give you a texture, a smoothness that's close to what you can get with a smoothing plane, but it'll also give it you over contrary grain, so knots and things like that. Very often, if you're careful, you can work out a little bit of tear out or whatever. You can get that down with the card scraper. I'm using them more and more. This tool chest I'm making, which I will talk about in a future episode, as it were, I'm trying to do it almost entirely hand tools. Not completely, but I'm scraping. I haven't, thus far, used any sandpaper on it. Of course, I haven't finished it yet, but and I'm going to paint it, so it doesn't have to be too fancy. But the card scraper was the old way to do it. These days, of course, we can sand by hand. I was willing. These I forgot what they're called. They're called Time Shaver, this particular brand, but they're really nice for getting sandpaper in because you have this lever that comes out instead of having to pull up a flap and have the thing caught in sharp little pins, bits that get in your fingers. These little block thing like this is really good. You can also just make blocks of wood and put sandpaper around it, but I find that this saves me money on sandpaper because it's got a slightly soft background. A wooden block has a very hard background, so if I'm working curved surfaces, these blocks are really nice.
Does a scraper actually cut, or does it burnish to a flat surface?
It cuts. You like everything, and this is something I'm going to digress for a minute. Hand tools. If you want, you can use a number. You will use a number of hands. You'll use squares and such like to check your work, whether you're mostly working with machines or not. But sharpening your tools it's critical. If you're going to use hand tools, you've got to know how to sharpen. It's not that difficult. It's not that challenging, and we will address sharpening in future. I tend to come back to sharpening pretty regularly in one form or another. But once you learn to sharpen your hand tools and learn what you can expect of them, it's astonishing what you can do with them. When I finally learned how to get a sharp blade, all of that talk that I'd heard about, all that romantic stuff about, having a relationship with your tool and the wood, it all fell into place. And it really helps. Another thing that you do with I'm going to just go back very quickly. Another thing that one does with a table saw is you cut shoulders. And again, there's a traditional tool called the shoulder plane, which you can see the blade reaches from one side to the other, so you can cut the full width of the plane, which is really nice, and you can hold it. It's got a lot of uprightness to it, so you can see that it's square. And you can use that to cut rabbets. You can use it to cut dados. This is a rabbet plane, a small hand rabbet plane. There are numerous different designs. But they're all designed to create rabbets, and they do them with much varying abilities. The traditional rabbet plane, of course, would have been wood. I should have had that over there. This is mine, and it has a slanted blade to help cut the grain out and to give you a kind of a point where it starts. This is an infill thing. I use this all the time. I bought it because I just thought it was nice and the price was right because it has no manufacturer's name on it. But it's an infill shoulder plane, and I use it for rabbeting all the time. I and it's solid. It's got a very, very straight edge, and it really works rabbits nicely. And this, by the way, this old one can be set up to produce just as fine a shaving as a brand new. One other tool I want to talk about very quickly. Again, you can cut dados. We have dado attachments, so that in a table saw we can create dados. Well, traditionally you use dados a lot: bookcases, shelving, all sorts of different functions. And this is a router plane. This is specifically good for things like dados, again for trimming rabbits, really good for trimming tenons if you're making them at home. Even if you're cutting them with a Tenon Saw, they're really good for trimming them. So this will drop down into a groove. You can see, you can drop this down into a groove and then move it back and forth. And if you've defined your dado with a saw, or even with just really sharp marking tools, you can use this to cut your dado. But it's called a router plane, which segues us over to the router. I think we're reasonably on track. Yeah. So in today's world, I got to briefly talk about, you know, I'm a hand tool nut. I love the hand tools. I just can't resist them, and I really love using them. But I'm not that good. I haven't been doing it very long, and I'm just not that skilled with hand tools. So there are 3 tools that I have at home, 2 of which I would call essential. One is a bandsaw, and the other is a router table and routers. The reason is because the router table is probably the most flexible machine, or the router is the most flexible machine that's been invented to date. You can use a router as a plane. You can use it, you can set up a router like this on a sled and use it to thickness a piece of wood if you need to. You can also, by putting multiple different bits in it, you can create almost any shape that they make a bit for. And of course, if you move up into shapers, which are delightfully dangerous machines, they use really big things to create things like moldings around for architectural moldings and so on. So you have the hand router, and you have or 2 hand routers, and then you have a router table, which everything here is sitting on. And I use my router table a lot because I don't have anything that I have got the skill yet to do grooves effectively. So, but I do have a few of the tools. This one actually belongs to the shop. It's a really nice old Stanley, number 71.5. And we sharpen the blade up. It's a really nice one. It's called a router plane. So your router can indeed cut dados, just like a router plane can. And then traditionally, I talked about moldings and so on. These are the wooden molding planes. So you would get a blade cut to the shape that you want the molding to be, and then you would use you would take that blade and then you would make a wooden plane as a sort of a craftsman. There you get the blade, make it yourself, and make this wooden plane with the bottom exactly the same shape as the blade. And you would even have some wear points, like for example this simple one has boxwood set into this groove. You can see it there. Because it's old, the boxwood has bent, and I'm going to have to find some boxwood and replace it. But again, slightly different molding shape there. This is just a nice round. But this again, that's the traditional way to do moldings. So you would make a unique piece for each molding. Then they came up with, in this era where Stanley particularly, once they started manufacturing these tools, they came up with a million different designs and all sorts of ingenious little add-ons and so on. But basic hand tool work doesn't need a lot of fancy equipment. But they did come up with this because one of the things about molding planes and for carpenters working on houses and so on, making moldings for the names are escaping me, but things like chair rails and so on, and around the ceilings and all that fun stuff. You would make these moldings using a variety of different tools. You wouldn't make, you use in one molding that's 6 inches wide, you might use several different tools, and you had to carry a lot of different molding planes around if you were going to work in, say an expensive home where they're putting in a lot of detail. So Stanley initially, I think, but this one's made by Sargent, came up with the combination plane. And all of these blades here will fit and work in the combination plane. Every now and again, I pull that out of its box. You can see this is a groove. This one's grooving. This one's an actual molding. But this combined with, I haven't got the right size here because it's in the blade, but the right size blade that's just like a small plain blade fits in there. This one will give you rounds. These are a few other ones that I've actually sharpened up, and you can see it. You can cut yourself a groove or a dado up to that width. These, as I say, tongue and groove. This is the tongue, and the groove would be cut by one of these over here. And then there are other planes that are very similar that will do many, many, many more moldings. But this is a skill level beyond which I have achieved so far. I keep messing with this thing. Right now, I've got a 1/8 inch grooving blade in there, but I've played with it and I can get a groove, but nothing like as precise without working up the skill as I can get with a router blade. So one has to be pragmatic. I do this for fun, and I want to learn how to use tools like this. However, if I can't use them, I'm not going to use a piece of furniture to learn on them. So I will use my router table, especially for grooves. Dados I don't have such a problem with, but for grooves, the router table is really nice. So now we're going to move into a different realm. So far we've been talking about cutting the surfaces of a piece of wood. So now we're going to go and look at a couple of other machines. As we go, I'd like you to note the scroll saw here. And then we'll go over to this bandsaw, and you see it has a small blade that can be removed, so you can make a hole in the wood, feed that blade through, and then attach it to your scroll saw and make a nice little pattern in the middle of a piece of wood. And we have the bandsaw here. So really, before the invention of the bandsaw, if you wanted to make curves, or you wanted to make, I think the scroll saw is a relatively recent invention. I'm talking relatively the last couple of hundred years. But there were some hand tools that you could use. This is a coping saw used by a lot of carpenters, a lot of woodworkers rather. The nice thing about this Olsen coping saw is that it's got an adjustable blade, adjustable tension. A lot of the other ones, at much the same price, but ones you can buy in the hardware stores, don't have this adjustable tension. And if you look at the shape, the way this is made, it's designed to be in tension, whereas the other ones are really not. But it doesn't cost much more. But this is a coping saw. I use it a lot for dovetails. This is a fret saw, and as you can see, it's not dissimilar from the basics of a scroll saw. So again, you can remove the blade, feed it through a hole in the middle of your wood, and then. So if you're looking at old fret cutting and scroll saw cutting, and you think about someone who was doing it like this, and it was quite a challenge. And then there's the, I can't remember the woodworker's name for it. It's commonly known as a jeweler's saw, but here's another one. I can fit a regular scroll saw blade, just the same as we use in a machine. I can fit that in there and adjust. I can adjust the length for different saws if I want. Clamp those down, and I don't use that much, but I use the coping saw a lot for things like dovetails. So I'm going to go on about bandsaws. When I started working with wood, I had a skill saw and a jigsaw and a few little hand tools, and that was about it. And I didn't know how, I didn't have an effective way to thickness wood, so I made myself a sled with a router from a, I think it was a fine woodworking project, and would thickness wood like that. It was incredibly noisy. My neighbors were virtually throwing rotten tomatoes at me. One of them even complained to the HOA, and it was very time consuming and incredibly messy to clean up afterwards. So eventually I did some research and I bought a bandsaw, and I have to say that I don't think, before the bandsaw, I don't think that they had anything that was as flexible as the bandsaw. I absolutely, it's the one machine tool I would just never, ever, ever want to be without. I just love my bandsaw. I can't speak highly enough of it. And it's very, very friendly towards hand tool work, you know, because you can cut a very straight line on a bandsaw, take a plane, do a couple of passes on the plane, and you've got a nice clean edge, which you would have to do anyway if you had a burn on your edge anyway. So, which bandsaw do you own? What I did was I bought the best available new. I bought it new because I had once had a bandsaw, an old Craftsman, and I could never ever get it to work properly. I have a Grizzly. They cost, sometimes they go on sale. They're in the $600 to $700 region. These are supposedly much better. All I've ever really worked with is the ones in the shop, the ones at Palomar and my Grizzly. And the key to that, much like a hand tool, is having it tuned up nicely. But I find the Grizzly to be, it doesn't have some of the refinements that other bandsaws have, and it's not as solidly made as this Italian one. I think this is Italian, and it doesn't have, for example, you can't wind your table to exactly what you want. You have to undo a couple of bolts, move it, check the angle, which you always need to check anyway. I found the Grizzly is just great. If ever I buy another one, it'll probably be one of this, of this kind of design, a Laguna or something similar. But it'll be wider, and I'll keep the Grizzly because that thing has worked for me. Once I got it set up nicely, it's just worked for the last 5 or 6 years beautifully. And I would not wish to learn the skills with hand tools to do everything that a bandsaw can. It's just a wonderful tool, and it really lends itself to that hybrid of machine and hand tool working.
What about Riken or Riken? I don't know how you say it.
Rikon? I don't know. I won't speak to a product I don't know. What I did was if you look through the archives of fine woodworkers, there are some articles where they compare different bandsaws. I would really take a look at those, look around on the internet, read reviews, find out what you want. I had to make that judgment of price against my own ignorance of what the saws could do. So I elected, for example, to buy a saw that didn't have a built-in light. Big mistake. Because now I have a light, it clamps on the fence, and it falls off every now and again and stuff like that. But so I would install a light of some kind. But the Grizzly is probably as low a quality as I would want to go. I wouldn't want to buy you know, something made by Rigid, or I hate to put down any manufacturer. And the Rikon, I simply don't know. I think they're a pretty good manufacturer. I have one of their low-speed grinders, and I've used other Rikon tools, and I think they're pretty good. All of these things become a balance of what you can afford against wasting your money. There are some instances, you know, like for example, you can buy, there's an Australian manufacturer, makes a rabbit plane that costs in the $1,500 range. It's made out of wood and it's got brass fittings, and it's like, if you can afford to get into your Gulfstream and fly there and pick it up from the factory, that's maybe the one you want to get. But at the same time, an old Stanley will do you just as well. Will actually do the job just as well. It's all about having the thing tuned up and having a sharp edge and having everything just lined up rightly. And it's like riding a bicycle and all of those other things we talk about, that once you've learned it, it's stuck with you forever. So I won't settle for anything but a sharp blade.
Nice. We've got some feedback on two folks who do own bandsaws.
Yeah.
One is a low-end Grizzly, but Travis has a hard time getting good consistency out of the blades.
That's a bench Grizzly, isn't it?
Yeah, a bench top. And David has a, how do you say, Rikon?
Right. Yeah.
Rikon 14-inch, said it works fine, but it does have some plastic parts he wishes were metal. So,
there's always something.
always.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, I would like to change the guides on mine, but you know, I've learned how to fix the guides. I finally found a source of bearings that don't clog up, and they're cheap. But you know, there are improvements that I'd like. But for me, I do this because I love working with wood.
Yeah.
When it comes down to it. So when I started, I had really crappy tools, but I still had a lot of fun, and it still bit me, you know. There was enough there. Even if you just don't have a lot of skill and you don't have a lot of tools, you can still make stuff that you like. And every time you make something and you think, okay, well, I want to make that, you know, that veneered Bombay chest of drawers, but you know, start by making a kid's toy, you know, with the tools that you've got, and go from there. And it's fun all the way. For me, it has been. You know, it's been a steep learning curve, and it's hard to get information sometimes because there aren't a lot of old pros around that work with hand tools. They just, you know, if you want to make money in woodwork, you've got to use machines. There's, you know, unless you have a reputation as an artist, you've really got to make money. So bandsaws, I would find it hard to replace. You know, I've tried using this fret saw, and I think I could learn to use it, but it definitely it's a learning curve. The coping saw, though, I think every woodworker should have one of those. And if you do find a way, you know, you just want to trim up a hole that's in the middle of a piece, at least you can get a little ways into the piece and put your blade in, and you can turn this blade. You can make it on a forward push or a backward push. I always set it up on a backward push, but you have that ability with a changeable blade like that. So time is running on, so I'm going to just go to our very last section, which is drills. We'll just take a look at these. Drill press. Obviously, we know we've got drill presses, we've got cordless drills. I have a miniature version of this. And by the way, I've got to say, and we're right here, you guys, when you next come in the shop, take a look around. They've really made some changes that make things so much better. Now, if I want to Forstner bit, I can go reach for it. I don't have to look and go, which box has got the Forstner bits in? It's just, these guys have really been working, and they've reorganized the, what we call the garage in there. So they put wood racks in there, and a lot of improvements over by the door there. So just look around. These guys, while we've had to close the shop, there have been people working in here using social distancing and so on, and really working to improve our shop. So anyway, drill presses, and you can see over here in the corner is a mortising tool, which is basically a square chisel with a drill in the middle, is what it boils down to. And it's powered by an electric motor, and you bring it down, and it's got 4 corners that cut in, and they make you a beautiful square hole. And if you do them side by side, you can make as big or small a mortise as you want, depending on the bit that you use. So this is the modern way to cut mortises. And if you are still selling furniture and you're making tenons on your saw bench and mortises on this, you could possibly still make money if you've got the right market. But I was speaking to somebody who makes a living doing selling handmade craftsman furniture, and the mortiser is one of his favorite pieces. So drill press and a mortiser. So it's been being done. Mortise and tenon joints are one of the oldest joints around. So we'll talk about that first. The mortiser. This is a mortising chisel. You'll notice that it is very thick because it's going to take a pounding. This is a chisel you use with a mallet. I don't use many chisels with a mallet, but this is designed for it. It's got, obviously any chisel should have a very flat back, but it's also got 2 perfectly square sides. And they're kind of polished, and they're carefully set so that as you cut down into your wood, you can use those edges to define your edge. Ideally, you mark it out with a knife first so that you don't, you cut the fibers and so on. But then you can take an old-time carpenter or woodworker would pound one of these, make a mortise in a couple of minutes. They didn't care about the sort of precision that we look for, because we're hobby woodworkers, and if I'm going to do it, I like to do it as precisely as I reasonably can. But if you're just making mortises to make furniture, and it's all going to be hidden by the glue joint there, or you're making sash windows or whatever, then something like this would be the tool you use to make a mortise. This one is for reaching into deeper holes. I couldn't resist it. It was at the hand tool swap meet. I bought that and another one for $15. And I just couldn't resist it. But I've never used it, but I have sharpened it up. But if you ever need to get into something really, like you're making a lock or something, putting a lock into a piece. And then there are obviously that goes down to 1/8 of an inch. These are sort of a hybrid mortise chisel. They're what's called a sash chisel, and would be used in the making of old sash windows and so on. But they can also be used for mortising. They're just, I don't know, I'm not going to pound these as hard. With this, you could, it's like unbreakable, or virtually unbreakable. Heavy-duty chisel designed to be used. And then the drill presses. So again, these are relatively modern tools. The bracing bit has been around forever, but traditionally it was made out of wood with a couple of metal bits. But this is possibly one of the classic images of woodwork, along with dovetails and so on. You can see they would get sold with a complete set, going down to 1/4 inch. You can also use them as a screwdriver, a countersink. I haven't sharpened this one up yet. And you could even use, for smaller diameters, you can fit these little drill bits in. So that's the traditional way to drill. And then you have the egg beater, which came in, I'm not sure the exact date, but you can see it's all metal and came with the Industrial Revolution. This one is an old Craftsman made by Miller's Falls, but in the handle has a set of drill bits. So, again, for the jobbing craftsperson, something like that's useful. You've got them all in the handle there. So I'm going to finish. Oh, and one last thing. I haven't got one, but the Forstner bit is not a new invention. This was designed for the bracing bit, the original Forstner bit. You can actually get adapters to go to this 6-piece. And I'm always on the lookout for some traditional Forstner bits to go into the brace. But they are a good way of making a circular hole with a relatively, you see this has a long thread on it to pull it through the wood. This one doesn't, it just has a point, so you create a relatively flat bottomed drill hole there. So again, they're pretty rare, the old Forstner bits, hand tool Forstner bits, and they tend to be rather expensive. So I'm going to finish up with a quick demo of, okay, so I want to make a 3/4 inch hole. At 90 degrees, relatively easy. Even at a slight angle, it's relatively easy. But I have to take it over to the drill press. I got to move it. If I've already got it in the vise though, I can go over and get this. I actually did cut some holes in some of our benches here. It's quiet, it's peaceful. The only thing I have to watch for is when that thread goes through the other side. So you'll see. Tell me when it comes.
Yep, there it is.
There it is. So at that point, you're going, huh, if he drills on through, that's going to tear out like crazy. Or maybe you're not thinking that far ahead. I turn it around, or in the case of that side of a piece of church, you know, a confessional or something like that, walk over to the other side of the large piece, make sure that the bit is properly secure. This is not my favorite of my 2 bits. You know what? I'm cutting through the wrong hole. There's a lot of meat here. So if I pick the right hole.
Happens to the best of us.
I'm thinking I should have been through by now. Because I used the center of that. You can see it. It should have a nice clean hole. No muss, no fuss. And if my cordless drill is down, and I don't know if you've ever tried to use, say, a spade bit in a cordless drill, or even something made like this designed to use in a drill press, but it's a mess. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to use that, but spade bits are just terrible pieces. Okay, so this is the old egg beater drill. You'll notice that the drill bit is somewhat different from a modern bit. Can you guys see that?
Oh, it's, yeah.
See, it's slightly different in design, but it's designed to work at a much slower speed. And if I just get that out of the way, you can see it's already making nice progress. But if I am using screws, if I'm pre-drilling the holes for the screws, nice clean drill hole. So, although I don't use the, and again, well, there is a little bit of a cut there, but you'll get that. You tend to get that. Now, if I were to put in the vise another piece of wood behind that, I wouldn't have even got the tear out there because I'd be just drilling straight through into one piece of wood. So that pretty much concludes my presentation. I'm under an hour and 15 minutes, which is better than usual. So I would love to answer any questions.
Would anyone like to unmic and ask any questions that haven't already been asked in chat?
Is the Mitre box, Paul, a significant starter tool, or to me it was, but you didn't mention it.
Which tool?
The Mitre box.
Mitre
A
box.
Mitre box. That's one of those tools you make yourself.
Yes.
I don't use myself a miter box. I used to have one that was made out of plastic, and the first 3 times I used it, the edges of the saw blade cut into the plastic and it wasn't straight anymore. Miter box is almost like a disposable tool. I would make it if I had a bunch of miters to cut, but I don't end up doing a whole lot in the way of miters these days. What I do have is a mitre shooting board, which is basically a 3-dimensional shooting board that you know has a 45-degree side, and I can run my my plane along the edge there and get a mitered edge. But yes, a miter board is a very valid tool. I would, as I say, be inclined to make one myself out of something like MDF.
It's quite a good starter tool for somebody who's beginning.
Absolutely, yes.
Right.
Yes, even to do that, just a nice straight 90-degree cut. Although it's called a miter box, it's also set up for a 90.
And that's for making picture frames, right? So you
Sorry?
can use those to make picture frames, the angle cuts.
People do use those for picture frames, yeah. Although there is a kind of a semi-hydraulic hand tool that people use to just basically guillotine through picture frames.
Oh, wow.
Because the reason I don't.
Someone recommended a Zoom session for making a miter box.
All right.
Yeah,
yes.
we like that, guys.
Yes.
Keep those suggestions coming.
Yes, absolutely. It's a simple little design.
Perfect.
Like everything in woodwork, the devil's in the details. You know, if you don't cut that perfect 45 and that perfect down when you make your box, it's going to be off forever. So, you know, you might even try to use as a beginning hand tool working. You might even, I expect those instructions probably envision using a table saw and such like, but I would use the machines to make that.
Cool.
Anything else?
When
Well,
did you
thank you all
last,
for
when
checking
did you
in.
last use a guillotine?
When was the last time you used a guillotine to make picture frames like that?
I've never made a picture frame in my life. But when I talked about making one with someone, they said, if you're going to do that, you should try and see if you know someone who's done it, because I don't know how it works, but I've seen video of them working, and you pull this thing down and it multiplies your force. The lever, somehow there's a mechanism in there, multiplies your force, brings down this little guillotine and gives a clean cut. And I'm thinking, how do they do that?
Everyone stay tuned for the Marie Antoinette episode where we make picture frames.
Yeah.
Yes, if any of you do that, please feel free to chime in and come in here and show us. I'll give you the airspace. I'd love to have other people on showing us how they do things.
At my school shop 70 years ago, the guillotine was the prime unit in the shop. They had a power saw, table saw, and the guillotine, and you basically made everything using the guillotine. And that was the most frequently line up at the guillotine, alongside where they had the hot glue being melted constantly in the corner of the shop.
Amazing.
Wow.
Well, interesting, yeah, because I don't remember that, but you know, yeah, my school woodshop experience was 50 years ago. But then I was growing up slightly after the World War. Yes.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Exceptional. Thank you, guys.
Thanks,
Thanks
Paul.
for your questions, Chris.
Thanks, guys.
We'll see you guys next time.
Thanks a lot. Have a good one. All right.